Well, good afternoon. Welcome to the PPOB meeting. Looks like we have a quorum. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Senator McDaniel.
Present from the district.
Thank you. Senator Mills.
Here in person?
Senator Neal. Senator Parrott.
Present in my home.
Thank you. Senator Wilson. Representative Graham. Representative Petrie.
Present in person.
Representative Tipton.
Here in the room.
Representative Weber. Representative Wheatley.
Here in the room.
John Chilton. Joseph Fons. Mike Harmon.
Here in the room.
John Hicks.
Here.
Thank you. Mike Jefferson. Sharon Mattingly.
Here online.
Thank you. Representative Miller.
Here in the room.
Senator Higdon.
Here in the room.
Representative Duplessis.
Here in my district.
Thank you.
Okay, we do have a quorum and duly authorized to do business today. We do need approval of the minutes. I entertain a motion to approve the minutes of the last meeting.
Senator Parrott, so moved.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion passes. Minutes are approved. Today on the agenda, Bo Barnes, this is unusual, but you're the only one on the agenda. It looks like a very short agenda today. Bo, introduce yourself for the record, please, and we'll let you we'll get started. I'll probably make a comment or two, and you can get started.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Bo, turn your mic on, please. We didn't do that for you. Sorry.
There we go. Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bo Barnes. I serve in the positions of Deputy Executive Secretary and General Counsel for the Teachers Retirement System, Kentucky. I've been asked today to make a presentation on the experience study that was recently completed by the TRS actuary. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to present and certainly welcome any questions that members of this board may have regarding this, and I'll do my best to answer those questions.
Thank you, Bo, and again, welcome, and appreciate you being here today. And we will have a lot of discussion on this. I watched the meeting you had Monday, and a couple items of good news came out of that. Your return on investments are very good, and applaud you for that. Also, the fact that the experience study came back at around $300 million additional dollars that we would have to pay instead of $500 million. That was certainly positive. and the longevity tables that people are living longer, even though it costs us more money. That is a good thing that life expectancy is going up in certain segments of the population. That additional money is if it comes all at one time is a very heavy lift. I know Mr. Harbin made the comment that it shouldn't be a heavy lift or any big deal to the General Assembly for the additional money, but it's anytime you ask the General Assembly for additional money, it is a heavy lift, and especially when we look at the $300 million that could be plus. I don't know exactly what the step up is, but over the years, the last 3 or 4 years, seems like every year we step up about $50 million. Last year in the budget for the 2021-22, the ask was $579 million, and we made that payment. I think your ask is already out for next year, $629 million. Again, a sizable increase in the ask and a sizable increase in the experience study. So I did want to make those comments. Also, one thing too that this committee ought to consider. Of course, leadership will have to approve it. But in the bill that we passed that created the PPOB committee, there's it's 7A.250. Anyway, there's a section in there that says that we may, I guess, hire an auditing firm to audit the state administrated retirement system to evaluate the reliability of each system's actuarial assumptions and methods. So that's not just TRS, Bo, it's all the systems. So members need to make a note of that, and like I said, we will be addressing that at some later date. Again, we'll have to, there is an expense to that, it's not free. So we need to get approval before we proceed on that. So, Mr. Barnes, the floor is yours, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let's see. Whoops. I apologize. There we go. Thank you again, Mr. Chair and members of this board. Pleasure to be here and to present to you the experience study. I have this PowerPoint, and again, certainly happy to take any and welcome any questions the board may have. I'd like to begin with, just as a refresher, and a reminder, what an experience study is. And so an experience study is a standard practice by actuaries across the nation in evaluating assumptions that they have projected for retirement systems. So it's a common practice, and it's a valuable tool for retirement systems. And I'm say they are evaluating projected assumptions, and using the word projected is because these assumptions are forward-looking. They're looking into the future and trying to predict, and using a statistical modeling and probability to try to predict what's going to happen. And so no one has a crystal ball. We don't know for sure what's going to happen. And that's why these periodic evaluations, which typically lead to some modifications in these assumptions along the way, that's why these occur, okay? And that's why these are necessary. The assumptions are reviewed, and you'll see this in the PowerPoint, but they include such things as investment rate of return, mortality, rates of retirement. And they're important, and they help the retirement system, assess its liabilities, which are the benefits that are payable from the trust funds, and also the funding sources needed and available to help pay for those benefits that go out. Most large public pension plans do an actuarial experience study every 5 years, as does TRS. But, of course, and as I've discussed here before, these assumptions are not looked at just every 5 years of experience study. They are looked at every single year, because every single year the actuary looks at what they had projected and what actually happened for that year, all these assumptions. And they publish something called an annual valuation. Those are on the TRS website. And part of that annual valuation that they do includes a gains-loss analysis. How did what they projected versus what actually happened shake up, how they compare. And based on that, they make adjustments. We make adjustments in our budget requests for every future year, for future years in the budget. We make adjustments to reflect those gains-losses every year. And those are included in the budget and incorporated in the budget on a 20-year amortized basis. Now, the experience study, we're not looking back just 1 year, of course. We're looking back 5 years. And, it's a 5-year period is a relatively short period of time, 5 years, versus these assumptions, which are long-term assumptions, say 30 years. So because of that, we know these are short-term periods that we're examining, 5 years, and these are long-term assumptions. As our actuary noted in its experience study, we don't overreact. Actuaries do not overreact because, for example, I've talked about the prior experience study that we had that was conducted for the 5-year period ending June 30th, 2015. And in that experience study, for example, our actuaries overprojected life expectancy. They thought that our teachers would live to this age, But for that 5-year period, just those 5 years, they lived to this age. So the actuary is looking at it because they are conservative. They didn't lower the mortality assumption all the way down to what they actually saw for those 5 years from 2001 to 2015. They lowered it a little bit because they know the next 5 years things can change, and they do change. So it's the approach is conservative, methodical. You're making little adjustments here to the left or to the right all along the way over that period of time that we are trying to pay off this unfunded liability. One more thing I'd like to, I guess, note about what experience studies are, and Representative Tipton kind of brought this up at the last meeting, and that is he asked if, these things look forward towards trends like investments, and they do. So it's not just a look back. These actuaries, they collect and analyze data from a lot of sources, including entities in the private sector, and, consultants out there in the investment and financial world, and from federal government sources as well. What was the federal government saying about things like inflation and those sort of things. So a lot goes into these studies. Now, this particular experience study that we're talking about today for this most recent 5-year period is different. There are some unique things about it, okay? First of all, typically with our experience studies, and we've been doing these for decades, the experience study is concluded sometime after the close of the then current fiscal year, which would be for us June 30th. For this experience study, it would be after the close of this fiscal year ending June 30th here in just a few days, a few short days. They would do it after that. There's been a lot of interest, more interest than I've ever seen in the experience, and understandably so, in this particular experience study. So we were asked, if this could be expedited a little bit. And so we talked to our actuaries, and we wanted to accommodate those requests. So we have an experience study that we have now today before the close of the fiscal year, which is sort of atypical. But what it does mean, we have some important information to share with this board today. But what it does mean is that because we are still in the current fiscal year and we've not come to the close of it, the information is incomplete for this fiscal year, and there's data that we don't have today that we'd have normally with experience studies. But again, we've got some important information to share with this board today, nonetheless. So what can I tell you today? I'm going to tell you today about what the assumptions are that the actuary established, and in our statute, the actuary establishes these assumptions for the board. That's their business, that's what they do, and our board ratifies. It's just a formal ratification process, and that now becomes part of our assumptions for the next 5 years until the next experience study. And those were first incorporated in the fiscal year 2021 annual valuation, the period of time that we're in right now, but not yet concluded. So that's what I can tell you. What I can't tell you with today is, because these assumptions are really, the first time they're going to take effect or have impact on the budget is for fiscal year 24, okay? As Senator Higdon said, we have the number, the budget request for fiscal year 23 at $629 million additional funding, and that is based on the valuation for fiscal year 2020 last year. So we have that, and that is ready. But we don't have the current valuation for 2021 yet because the year is not concluded. That valuation is, in past years, it's presented at sometime in November, okay? And that's when we have greater certainty about what the numbers are going to be. We do after the close of the fiscal year, when we have employer reports in from all the districts and all this other information from the close of the fiscal year, we do provide estimates of future budget request, okay? And we will do that for 2024, and that estimate of the budget request for 2024, which is, again, the first year that these assumptions will impact, that will be made available to this body as soon as they are available. And furthermore, after we get the annual valuation completed for 2021, upon which the budget request for fiscal year 2024 will be made, we'll provide the actual final number to this body as soon as that is available. So that's one thing that's different with here, the timing. There's something else. There are a couple more things that are really unique. The timing of this particular experience study. One is, again, as Senator Higdon noted, investments were really, really exceptional this year. And I reported on those at the last Public Pension Oversight Board meeting. For the first 9 months, the first 3 quarters of the current fiscal year we're in, for the period ending March 30th of this year, our returns were over 20% in 9 months. We added just to the pension fund, I've got some numbers I'm going to show you later, but we added just to the pension fund $4 billion in additional assets in 9 months. That is exceptional, okay? So this experience study, because we're completing this before the close of this fiscal year, it does not take into account the exceptional gain in assets that we have had over this past year. It's not included. It's considered. But those gain in assets are very important in respect to one thing that the experience study noted, and there is a discussion in the experience study about what some states are doing, and it's a sort of a newer trend, but what some states are starting to do, and a growing trend with assumption changes. And I'm talking about states like Georgia, Mississippi, you got North Carolina, and then there's several others too, but just to name a few, I'm thinking off the top of my head, they are finding ways to phase in changes to assumptions, particularly investment rate return assumption, okay? So instead of having that all at once, a more methodical, measured manner, they will do that over a period of time, 5 years, for example. So given that we had, even 9 months into this year, a $4 billion gain in assets, that is certainly worthy to consider phasing in that gain in assets with the changes in assumptions. And that's something that will be presented and discussed with the Board of Trustees at September meeting. And I just don't know what that is now, or I can't speak to the board before they've spoken, and I don't know what they'll say, but I think they'll certainly consider, particularly given the actuaries' discussion about that being an available tool, available to use, it'd be appropriate, given that other states are finding this appropriate and are using it. States with conservative funding plans are doing this. That is something that I think this will be part of this eventually, a part of the budget process. So I just don't have that information today. But again, all of this will be made available to this board as soon as it is possible. Something else that is just very unique about the timing of this experience study is that this body, the General Assembly, enacted House Bill 258 this past session, and that is the bill that establishes a new retirement tier for TRS, specifically for individuals who become members of the retirement system on or after January 1st, 2022. They're going to be in a new tier. And the most significant thing about that new tier, and it is a sea change in how retirement benefits are going to be provided for this new tier, in that the Commonwealth is ending responsibility for future unfunded liabilities that could arise from these new tier members, okay? It ends January 1st, 2022. They will have no further responsibility for new members coming in. And, the Commonwealth is, if you will, they're getting out of the business of being the unfunded liability business, okay, with this new legislation, this landmark legislation, I'd even call it, that was enacted just in this session. So we will, for example, with this new tier, you're going to, in about 10 years, you'll see about half of all active members will be in this new tier plan, for which the Commonwealth will have no responsibility for the any developing unfunded liability. But the Commonwealth still does, of course, responsibility for the existing legacy unfunded liability, okay? And the good news there is there's a funding plan in place, and retirement system staff, and I know teachers, are all very thankful about the additional funding that we are now getting for the TRS, the full funding that TRS is getting for the pension, and that with that full funding, we are enacting this funding plan. With this full funding, it is highly significant. It's of greatest importance in helping us achieve the returns where we had a $4 billion increase from investments, returns over the first 9 months. And we have, by putting this funding plan in place, which was initially a 30-year amortization period to pay off the unfunded liability, we're down to about 24 years now. So 24 years from now, whatever number of members are left in the current plan, and there'll be a lot fewer, obviously, because there are going to be retirements between now and the next 24 years. There'll be fewer and fewer and fewer, and there'll be more in the new tier each year. We will eventually have that, we'll be 100% funded. And for those who are still in the current tier, the cost to the Commonwealth that we will bill in today's dollars would be slightly less than Social Security. So, there's a lot of things that are different about this timing of this one. And this experience study does not, it does not account for that sort of change.
Oh, can I interrupt you? I have Senator Wilson has a question, and if you don't mind, we'll kind of do some of these as we go.
Yes,
Senator
sir.
Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Bo, thank you for being here today, and was looking at some of this already. My question, I know that it's mentioned the $629 million that's additional funding that has already been determined for 2023. What is the 13% payroll that is required by statute? How much money is that in addition to the $629 million?
So the 13% is almost $500 million a year. That reflects both pension and medical, the 13105.
Okay. So does the 625 million just reflect the ARC, or 629?
Yes, sir. That is the additional funding that is needed to make sure that funding plan is implemented to pay off the existing legacy unfunded liability over 24 years. That 13,105% and 0.75% of that is medical. That's actually more than what we need to pay what would be the normal cost if we didn't have an unfunded liability. We're getting more than for normal cost, but it's not enough to pay off this unfunded liability over a 30-year period, now 24 years remaining.
So,
Can I excuse me just a second? I'm going to tell Bo there's nothing normal about normal call.
Yes, sir.
Senator Wilson.
so in effect, to really fully fund it, it takes $1.12 billion is what we're
Roughly, I don't think I have the exact budget numbers with me today, but that's in the neighborhood, $1.1 billion.
Okay. And just the last thing, you already mentioned the new tier in HB 258. And so as far as we know, there was no impact that was taken into account for this particular experience study for that new tier.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, one other question before you get back on track. That the green box dollars, is that included in the 629? Or is that additional?
Yes. Oh, no. That's additional. That's a special supplement.
Okay. Okay. So we got we have the ARC, and then we have the normal cost, and then the green box. What other supplemental monies are we sending to TRS?
Well, there have been, of course, payments towards the health insurance trust, that have been made, and with what we call the green box dollars, those are supplemental appropriations made by the General Assembly for things like sick leave. There were some old cost of living adjustments that where we increased the standard 1.5% cost of living adjustment. well, I'll get back to a second, where we increased the cost of living adjustment, and we only did that if there was funding in the budget for it. So that hasn't happened since 2008. And the Commonwealth, instead of paying that in lump sum, they were paying that on an amortized basis over 20 years. So we still have a little bit of that left, but those old COLAs those adjustments to old COLAs, increasing them, and the payments for those installment payments are going away or fading out. So those will eventually, soon, very shortly, be gone completely. And again, we haven't provided any COLAs above the 1.5% unless there was funding to pay for it. Also included in the green box, and there might be one more year of that, is in early 2000s, the General Assembly was looking at the retirement allowance of some of our teachers who retired a long, long time ago. And their salaries were so low back then, and COLAs hadn't kept up their retirements, that they provided a minimum benefit. I think it's $440 a month, or $44 per year of service, guaranteed. And that was really just to kind of get those folks above the poverty level. And thinking about that $629 million, and I'm seeing the budget spreadsheet right now in my mind's eye. Again, I apologize, I don't have that with me, but I think that 629, that is the all-in figure for the additional, and would include, I'm pretty sure, the supplemental requirements as well, because that's a line item that captures everything really pretty much outside of what's going on with the SEEK formula. That's the other big part.
Bo,
And that's the 13105.
If you don't mind, would you sometime provide us with the information? Because that's something we don't hear about a whole lot, is the green box dollar.
Yeah.
It's particularly interested in, the health insurance and sick leave. And like I said, the COLA and some of that other that's about to run out, but it would be nice to
Yes, sir.
to see what, because it's been a long time since we had a green box discussion. That's another one of those things as clear as, it's recallable nickels and some other things around here. It's prevailing,
I can provide today that those green box dollars, or a lot of those installment streams, are running out. The old COLAs adjustments, the old minimum benefit values, to get those teachers retire a long time, get their retirement allowances up. So that pretty much all we'll be left with green box dollars here very shortly is going to be sick leave.
would be, like I said,
Yes, sir.
it's always good to know what those figures are.
Yes, sir.
Auditor Harmon, do you have a question? Okay. All right, Bo, please proceed.
Okay. So this is high-level highlights, okay, of what's going on. And there are a lot of assumptions and there are a lot of things that change, but these are the biggest ones. You'll see at the top there, the investment return assumption is reduced for all plans, pension and health insurance, to 7.1%. Okay, for pension that had been 7.5%, so we're moving down to a 7.1% assumed rate of return on investments. And I have some more slides to follow up on that here shortly. Talk about investments. Lowering the payroll growth assumption to 2.75. As this body knows, that has been 3.5%, and is being lowered now to 2.75. This is the second consecutive experience study that has lowered the payroll growth assumption. And then also, you see the third bullet point there is updating to new teacher-specific mortality tables. And then that's something that Chair Higdon talked about, at the beginning too. So actuaries were using kind of general population mortality tables, have been, but there has been a multi-year data collection process by the Society of Actuaries and a group of actuaries working with them to develop mortality tables that are specific to teachers. And the reason they're doing that is, there was a feeling that, teachers are going to have longer lifespans. They might, have better access to health care, or, taking better care of themselves, and, going to the doctor and those sort of things. So that took quite some time to do. And this is the first experience study that we've had this new data set available, that our actuaries have had this new data set available to use to project mortality. And that's another reason kind of this experience study is, a little unique, because we have a big change in data that we have now that we didn't have, but actually we didn't have before. And once this adjustment is made, adjustments to mortality will follow more along the line that we've seen in the past. They won't be what we're going to see here today. Because we've adjusted we're covering just teachers. Something else that they're doing with these new mortality tables is they're looking at a teacher today who, for example, is 60 years old, and they are projecting with these new mortality tables that they will live to X age. But for a teacher who is 20, for example, 21, just starting out, let's say, they are projecting an even extended lifespan. So, for example, maybe the teacher who's 60, projecting they're going to live to 81. For the teacher who's, say, 30 or 40, and 84, something like that they will live a little bit longer. So that's part of these new mortality tables.
Bo, Representative Miller has a question.
Yes, sir.
Hello, Bo. Thank you for the information. On this slide, are the first two economic assumptions and the last one a demographic? Because I know in the CAVMAC study, they segmented, these are the economic issues, these are the demographic issues. Am I correct on that?
Yes. So yes, the mortality is definitely a demographic factor, and that's these are the investments is an important economic driver, for sure.
So it is. I have those two correct. In terms of order of magnitude, could you put an order of magnitude on? Are those listed in fiscal impact order?
Yes, sir. I have a slide that's coming up that will show the
Right.
impact of these on the.
Thank you.
Bo, can I ask you on the payroll growth? I think last several years it's been payroll growth has hovered around 1%. So, and they set the assumption at 2 3/4. Can you explain how they come up with that number?
It's it has payroll growth since the Great Recession in 2008 has been low. Clearly, in periods before that, you could see some very strong payroll growth for teachers in Kentucky, and this is what payroll growth is. This is specific to teachers, okay? And payroll growth, it's total payroll, okay? It's not individual salaries, it's total payroll. And total payroll can grow two ways: increasing the number of teachers and or increasing raises generally across the board for these teachers. Those are two ways you can see payroll growth. And this is a long-term assumption. It's not 5 years, it's not 10 years. This is like a 30-year assumption number, payroll growth. And most of that assumed payroll growth, 2.5% of that 2.75% in the current assumption is inflation. And inflation, like teacher payroll, has been low since 2008-9, the Great Recession. And again, no one has a crystal ball, but this inflation rate of 2.5% is in line with what the actuary for the Social Security Administration has predicted, and other public and private entities are predicting it's within the range of where they see an inflation going forward. I don't know, and again, I said last time I'm not an economist, but certainly you're seeing a lot of reports today about there being pressures on inflation going up. And whether that's long-term or short-term seems to be a matter of debate right now. And I certainly don't know, but I think because they not only look in the past, these actuaries with experience studies, that are also looking forward to what's going on in the future, I would say that, since inflation is such a large part of that, they felt comfortable that keeping it 2.5, because that's certainly within the reasonable range of where all these other public and private outside entities are seeing inflation heading in the future. Let's see. This shows, this chart comes from a survey that is that was conducted by the National Association of State Retirement Administrators, and that's a large nonprofit organization that public pension plans belong to, and a lot of public pension plans, most, and they do a survey of plans, of large plans, just to see what their assumed investment returns are. And you can see that most are at 7% at 37, and the second most are 7% to 7.5% at 36. So with 7.1, we feel like that's a conservative, measure, being right there in average of all these plans. Particularly, in light of our investment performance. We are an above average investment performer. We've been an above average investment performer, and we're putting our assumed rate of return in very conservatively right here, sort of in the middle of the other public pension plans. Representative Miller, this gets to the slide that you were talking about that shows the weight of the impact of these assumption changes. All these numbers are in billions, and so I'll say what they are, but it's, you see at the very top, total liabilities of the retirement system, were $35.58 billion as of June 30th, 2020, okay? And below that, you will see the impact of those assumption changes that the actuary looked at on the liabilities. And starting at the top, you'll see member withdrawals. So that's members who retire before getting their retirement account and they refund their contributions. When they do that, that's a positive experience. So we see there's a $70 million increase in liabilities, which meant there were fewer people, for example, refunding their retirement accounts before they're eligible to retire. Service retirements, that added $50 million to the liabilities. And again, we're talking about long-term liabilities here. That added $50 million. Then here we get to mortality tables. And this is why this was on the previous page, because you can see mortality increased the liabilities by $1.49 billion. Okay? Below mortality tables, you see salary changes. And that's a decrease in liabilities of $400 million, okay? And the reason the liabilities decreased by $400 million is when you lower payroll growth, a component of that are individual salaries, okay? So they had projected that teacher salaries were going to be here, but they are now saying they're going to be lower, they're going to be less. Based on what they're looking at, past experience. And when you lower teacher salaries, you lower the retirement benefits that are going to be paid on them, because teachers' retirement allowances are calculated in part based on not just their years of service, but on their salaries. So lowering salaries lowers benefits and therefore lowers liabilities. Sick leave. Sick leave was increased liabilities, $120 million. Lowering it says discount factor, also, that's a way of saying, the assumed rate of return. That increased liabilities by $1.65 billion. So there you have the biggest driver, of increased liabilities as a result of these assumption changes, followed by the mortality tables at $1.49 billion. And then the net result is that with all of these changes, we increased those liabilities of $35.58 billion to $2.95 billion. And again, not all of this is due now. These are long-term liabilities that we have. These are long-term benefits we're paying out over decades. So not all this is due now, and some of this may never be due, depending on what happens with the next experience study. It could go the other way, just like life expectancy flipped from the prior experience study ending June 3rd, 2015 to the most recent experience study. These things do change, and we make and the actuaries make measured adjustments based on those changes. If also, for example, about how these things might change, if TRS continues to earn 7.5% instead of 7.1%, if it continues to perform as it has performed, much of this increased liability can go away, okay?
Representative Mills, or Senator Mills, excuse me. Forgot where
No
I was.
problem. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Bo, question on the mortality tables.
Yes, sir.
Do we know if we would have used the old mortality tables or the old way of looking at mortality rates as opposed to the teacher-specific mortality rates, what this number would be?
Oh, no, sir. Well, it's,
Would it be
It is
Would it be
increasing-
close, or
I'm sorry?
would it be close to this number, do you think? Or?
Yeah, yes. No, it would be, so what you see here is this is an increase over the old mortality rates of liabilities by $1.49 billion.
Right.
So long-term liabilities increased by that amount when you compare this new data set that we
Yeah.
have had since really early 2019. So it's something new. And the first experience that we could have used it. This new compared to the old results in an increase by that $1.49 billion in liabilities.
But are you saying that would this increase actually be more if it was spread out over the general population as opposed to teacher specific? You understand?
No, it's
Or would it have been less?
and I'm sorry if I'm not understanding, but the question, but it's it is more because of being teacher specific
Okay.
than general population.
Okay. Do we know what that number would be, not being teacher specific?
Yes, because the old number was the general population.
Okay.
And so the old population gave us lower liabilities because the general population does not live as long as teachers. They tend to take better care of themselves. They tend to be conservative, educated, go to the doctor when they need to, and take their medicine and all that stuff. So they, because they do live longer, that's why we see the $1.49 billion increase in liabilities.
Was there any discussion amongst the board about not doing teacher specific mortality tables?
No. And again, under the statute, the actuary establishes these assumptions, and our board has more of just a formal process of ratification
Okay.
to formally approve these assumptions that are established. And our board, when I work with them a lot, obviously, they have a conservative approach to things, and I think from what I saw at the meeting and watching them as these new assumptions were announced, I think they see it as staff do, that these new mortality change assumptions, where we now have data after years of collection, and we now have data mortality just for specific teachers. That's a good thing. That's a useful tool to help us better, define liabilities. And so we welcome it, and I'm sure that our board members, every single one of them, welcome having this additional tool as well. And again, it's kind of a one-off thing, because this is not something that normally happens. You have changes in mortality based on experience and general population trends, but now we're kind of stepped it up a little bit for this time. Next time we won't have a step up, because there won't be a new change. I mean, we're teacher specific now. We can't get any better than that as far as really drilling down on who our population is. So all good questions.
Thank you.
Yes, Co-Chair Duplessis has a question.
Thank you, Chairman. Bo, thank you for your presentation so far. I would like a little more explanation. You maybe gave it, and I didn't hear it on the phone, but the $120 million in increased liabilities due to sick leave. Can you explain that change, please?
Yes, sir. So when the actuary is looking at experience, they really, really drill down to a fine level, okay? And so with sick leave, what happened this time is they looking at sick leave, and they found that our teachers who are retiring with sick leave tend to be the higher paid teachers or higher paid members, not just teachers, but administrators and the other folks who participate in TRS. The people who have the sick leave, who keep their sick leave, tend to be in the higher paid positions. So therefore, higher payout on unused sick leave, more payout to use for retirement calculation purposes. Very, very good question.
But I'm
So
gonna
it-
follow up with, go ahead. Please continue.
So thank you. So the 120 million in sick leave, how much of that is due to what we've termed spiking, where they're saving it all up and applying it in a year?
Well, sick leave, all of sick leave accumulated over.
And I don't think I answered I don't think I asked I'm sorry to interrupt you. I don't think I asked my question well.
Okay.
Let me ask it a little better. The fact that we've had a change as 120 million tells me that there's a change in the trend. In other words, that educators have kind of found this loophole of using sick leave more and more and more for their higher pension payments that maybe they didn't realize they had 20 years ago, and that's now become a trend, and more this is going to keep going up as more and more take advantage of this loophole. Is that a fair statement?
It could be. It could be. There's a limit there in that teachers do have to use sick leave days, so they can't keep most teachers. I mean, a teacher who doesn't use any sick leave days is blessed, but most teachers are going to have to use sick leave days, and there's a limit in how many sick leave days they're going to have at retirement. But I guess to get to your question, this is anecdotal, but I know and I hear from superintendents and other administrators, in districts and other employers that they do advise their teachers about, the value of sick leave being used for retirement calculation purposes. And the reason that they do that is they're trying to discourage, they're telling me that they're trying to discourage absenteeism in the classroom. And they think by, letting them know that this can be used not just that they get paid for it at retirement at unused sick leave at 30% of their daily rate, but that additionally that payment can be used for retirement calculation purposes. That seems to be maybe a more common message, maybe from superintendents to their teaching staff. So that there may be an increase in sick leave because of that, and more because of that you have more awareness of the value of sick leave. Yes, sir. Did that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Representative Miller.
I had one question, but I'm going to add a preface to it. You've mentioned a couple of times about whether the board adopts the recommendation.
Yes, sir.
And whether it's the actuary's recommendation or management's recommendation, what's the last time the board didn't accept one of your recommendations?
Well, the board.
Can you give me an instance?
No, and because the board will be presented not just the evaluations, it's not the assumptions and the change in assumptions. They are provided the reasons they are for. And again, I've been with the it'll be 22 years this year, and during that period of time, the actuaries have come back with very measured assumptions that are well within, ranges, either from what other pension plans are doing, from what, for example, investment consultants, large investment consultants are saying. They're coming back with reasonable recommendations that are within that range, and then they are making adjustments based on experience and anticipated future trends. So they've had a conservative, measured approach with that, and that's what the board has seen. That's what staff have seen with the actuaries. And then furthermore, the board does hire another actuary to review those assumptions of our actuary. That was last done for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2014. And Siegel came in and did a full replication audit. That means they look at all the actuarial, assumptions that our actuary is using. And one of the managing partners of Siegel, it came before this body. This was, years ago, obviously. But they said it was, one of the cleanest audits they've seen, that was almost fully lined up, with what they projected. So, and we will have another actuarial audit by an outside independent actuarial firm looking at our actuarial firm for the fiscal year ending June 30th, 2024.
So, follow-ups, Mr. Chairman.
Please proceed.
So did TRS staff, did you and Mr. Harbin get a draft copy of the CAFMAC report before it became public?
Particularly because of the kind of the rushed up
able to
time.
provide
We had
feedback?
a few days. They ask us, to review, for example, for if we see any errors, or it can be wording, whatever. We review it like we do, actual audits and those sort of things. You have an opportunity, as all state agencies do, to comment and say, well, we think this number here, this payroll number here, or this particular year's contributions or payroll that was reported to us, there's a typo here, or there's a mistake here.
Okay.
It's really this.
All right. Now, may I ask my real question?
Yes,
that
sir.
I started out. If you go on your experience study, if the only decrease is salary changes, but that's to the unfunded liability. If I'm not wrong, the question is, what is the impact of the change on the ARC on an ongoing basis? Because the fact that we're not spreading out the cost over 3.5 or 3.25% salary increase, it's only 2.75% salary increase. Do you know the impact of that on the ongoing ARC in the out years?
That's in dollar amounts. That's where we get into. That's where I have some uncertainty because we haven't closed out this fiscal year. We don't have the 2021 valuation, and I've got a chart or slide that I would like to show here in just a couple that kind of shows, the impact that might have.
I'll wait. Thank you.
Bo, I do have one more question for you before you start, and I might be jumping around, but it's the assumed rate of return. It was 7.5, and that was 3% inflation, 4.5% real return. And the assumption changed. You lower the inflation rate to 2.5% and increased the real return to 4.6. Are you pretty comfortable with those numbers?
Yes.
Okay.
There's been a lot of analysis done on this, including by our own internal investment staff, historic analysis on inflation and real return, and we feel very, very comfortable with that based on past history going back to the 20s.
Okay. Thank you. Please proceed.
So this was for the retirement annuity trust or the pension. I should have pointed that out to begin with, but we also have a similar slide like this for the health insurance trust, and that is the next slide that you will see here. And in same format, and I'll just go over that again. You will see that the total liabilities as of June 30th, 2020 were $2.76 billion. And then below, that's at the top, and then below that you have what changes and assumptions did to that, okay? So member withdrawals, again, that's people leaving the system before they're eligible to retire, mostly. You see that's a $10 million increase to liabilities. Retirements, $10 million increase. This is for that 5-year period. That means we had retirements more than anticipated for that period of time. I can say that for last fiscal year and for this fiscal year so far, retirements are really down, like the lowest in 20 years, okay? So again, for the next 5-year experience study, these retirements could look different. Mortality tables, again, as you'd expect, people living longer, they're drawing insurance, or receiving health insurance benefits longer, an increase of $140 million. Salary changes, $3 million increase. Member participation, just how many people are, in the program. That was savings of $3 million. Healthcare trends like medical inflation, $130 million decrease in liability, and then lowering the discount factor or the assumed rate of return to 7.1%. That's $320 billion increase in liability. So at the end, you have an increase in liabilities for the health insurance trust in the amount of $350 million. Here it gets to some points that we've kind of already made, but just to highlight again, and then again, as Senator Higdon pointed out at the very beginning of this meeting, next budget, the General Assembly will convene in 2022 to work on the budget for fiscal years 23 and 24. The budget request for the additional funding for full ARC or ADEC for the pension fund has already been established with the 2020 valuation. We know that's $629.4 million. We know that's what we're going to ask for the first year of the next budget, fiscal year 2023. And then the 2024 budget request will ultimately be decided by the 2021 valuation, which of course we haven't completed that year yet. But again, we will make both the estimate and the final budget request available to this body as soon as possible. This shows, again, there's things going on in this experience study that, of timing, that are somewhat unique, and this is one of them. This shows returns for the 5-year period that was subject of the experience study. And you can see the years on the far left, and the middle column is the actuarial value, so that's the 5-year smoothing. What would those returns be? What are those returns with the 5-year actual smoothing, which is what actuaries do. We're not mark to market with actuarial return assumptions. And to the right, you see the actual market value returns, and those are the ones, that I report here periodically to the system on a quarterly basis, to the board on a quarterly basis. And you can see, let's go to the next to the bottom line in this, and you see 2016 was a really bad year, -1. And I remember coming here and talking about that and how there was particularly one quarter or maybe two where value stocks really, really underperformed, that year. It doesn't mean they're bad. It just means, no asset class is going to do great every single year. There are years where they're favored and years where they're not favored, but we're looking long-term. So we want long-term results so we don't get too worried about an asset class underperforming in 1 year. Value stocks are valuable. They're an important part of our investment strategy and to help us pay these benefits. But that just happened to be an off year, -1. And then you see we had some good years, 15, 10.5, 5.6, 5.5. And with this valuation, that we're going to be doing here for 2021, we're going to roll off that -1% and replace it with whatever this year turns out to be, which was over 20% for the first 9 months of this current fiscal year. So that, that's good timing. I mean, that could help with what we're doing with our budget request. And this is just a little more data on what happened with these investment gains. The top is a pension, retirement annuity trust or pension, and the bottom block is the health insurance trust. And again, this reflects just 9 months, the first 3 quarters of the current fiscal year. Total investment gains that we had, $4.4 billion. That resulted, those investment gains resulted in an increase in plan assets for the pension trust from $20.717 billion to $24.742 billion. So that's where we get actually a little over $4 billion increase in gains for the pension fund just in 9 months. Below that block, you see the block for the health insurance trust. Again, investment gains for those 9 months of $367.4 million. It's a smaller trust. It's the health insurance, not the pension, but significant gains. And you saw an increase in plan assets over that 9-month period from $1.616 billion to March 31st. It grew to $2.126 billion. So, strong asset gains for both the pension and the health insurance trust. And that concludes my presentation. I hope to kind of give hoped to try to give sort of an understandable overview of what's going on with this experience, what it is, and what's going on with the experience study, and where we are with the experience study.
Thank you, Bo. You got through that pretty quick. When we talk about the mortality tables and retirees living longer, do you assess any unfunded liability to COLA? Because obviously, if people are living longer, there'll be more COLA, more increases in their. Is that in the formula somewhere?
Yes, sir. So it's going to be both. They're going to be living longer and receiving retirement allowances longer, and those retirement allowances will grow at 1.5% a year.
Is that included in the assumption? I guess is what I'm asking. Is that calculated as an unfunded liability?
I believe, yes. I mean, I believe that the COLA, the impact of the COLA on the retirement allowances is included in the actuary's assumption. I can double check with the actuary just to make sure and report back, though.
Thank you. Representative Tipton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a few questions. I'll do them one at a time if you could bear with me. Bo, I want to refer to the complete executive summary on page 7. So you'll have a reference. And obviously you've talked about some of the major pension assumptions, but there are other assumptions
Yes, sir.
that go into the calculation.
Yes, sir.
And specifically, on the top of page 7, it refers that currently there's no contribution made for administrative expenses. And they've calculated that, projected that to be 0.32%. And the recommendation was that this would be added to the total normal cost. So if the board accepted this recommendation, if I'm understanding this right, that 0.32% is now baked into the cost. Am I reading that correctly? And how much of a dollar value is that?
Yeah, so that is that 0.3% is it's going to be a small number. We're for administration, our current budget I think is $16 million. Okay, so compared to the $33 billion in liabilities, it's not really going to show up really as having made much of an impact. It is added, but it's just I don't have a dollar figure.
So I understand, but just wanted to point that out, that instead of the system absorbing a loss on administrative costs, it's calculated in to the contribution now. Mr. Chair, if I could have another follow-up, please. And this is digging in a little deeper on Representative Duplessis' question about the sick day credit. And it's referenced here on the bottom paragraph of page 7. And it says currently, we assume a 2% load for this. It goes down and says that they assume that for those who use the sick day, it adds approximately 0.5 years of service. And it talks about the average additional payroll for those members is around $13,500. Then it goes on to say that this will increase the load from 2 to 3% for all active liability. Is this where that $120 million comes into play?
Yes, sir. So it's the extra half year of service, additional payroll of $13,500. So yes, that's where we see the increase in $120 million in liabilities.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, if I could proceed. On disability retirement, I read into this. Did I understand correctly that there is a recommendation that the benefit for disability requirement will be reduced?
No.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure. I know they made some assumptions on there. I'm reading through that. I want to make sure I understand that correctly. So there's no change in the amount of the benefit.
No.
Is there an increased cost to the system for disability retirement then?
That's the issue, yes, sir.
So there's going to be an additional cost based on they're going to need more money for the disability requirements is what they're projecting.
Yeah, so we have that well, I don't have it's a very small number. It is something that was considered. So you see the changes in liabilities on the retirement annuity trust as a result of the assumption of changes. Had we had disability on here, and the percentage that they provide would be 0.00 because it was that small of an increase.
Sure, I understand. So it's a minute amount.
Yes, sir.
On the, if I can proceed, Mr.
Yes,
Chairman.
sir.
On the health insurance trust, we're lowering the assumed rate of return to 7.1, is adding $200 some million additional liability. I know we've talked in the past, we've projected how long it would take to get that system to 100% funded. What impact will this have on getting these changes have on us on getting that to 100% funded?
Yes, sir. Good question. Health insurance trust is doing well. We are on track, to have that funded sooner rather than later in a few years. Lowering that discount rate will have an impact. It'll push that time period out. We knew there were going to be changes, and we discussed, having health insurance fully funded just in a few years. But we're going to push that out a few years with a lower discount rate that you'll see here. I think we'll have a much, much better idea when we get the current fiscal year 2021 valuation done and can see where we are. I'm really, really, as much as I look forward to this experience study, I'm looking forward to the valuation for 2021.
Absolutely. Mr. Chair, one more question,
Go
then,
right
then,
ahead.
then I'll pass the baton. Senator Higdon asked a question later about green box dollars, other things that are funded. I was not here in 2010, but I'm referring to the shared responsibility plan. It's my understanding there was a bond taken at that time.
Yes, sir.
Where are we on that bond? How much are the annual payments, and how much longer are we subject to paying on that bond?
Oh boy, we are getting close on that because there were 3 bonds issued. Okay, the first bond was issued in August of 2010, $469 million. I think $467 million of that went to the pension. To the General Assembly was helping with a bad situation. But the contributions, that from pension to medical, but they repaid that in full with that bond. Okay. And then there were 2 smaller bonds in 2011 and 2013 just to help provide transitional dollars to the health insurance trust to keep benefits paid, because active teacher contributions, retired teacher contributions, additional, and school district contributions were phased in over a period of 6 years. So, but those bonds, to your question, I apologize. Those bonds are, I think it was I think the first one was a 20-year bond. I think they were all 20-year bonds. I apologize for not recalling that right now. But we're rolling.
We're about halfway there then.
And as that
a little
debt,
over halfway.
Yes, sir. And as that debt service rolls off, it's being applied to the ARC or ADEC request in our budget.
But I do want to point something out. That's that those bonds were money that the General Assembly borrowed from TRS to pay health insurance costs, and there was rumors over the years that we, I guess, took money from teachers' retirement and didn't pay it back.
Yes, sir.
But just want to get that crystal clear that it was about $800 million, and the good thing about that is we owed you money when the market crashed, and so you got paid back with good money instead of a reduced amount. If it had been in your accounts, it'd been reduced substantially. So I just want to make sure that people understood that we did pay that money back. We bonded that.
Yes, sir, absolutely. I heard the same thing that you've heard over the years, and I try to correct that when I can. And you're exactly right. That bond money was received at a great time.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, this is John Hicks. I've got I've got a quick answer on the bonds. The last year of debt service is fiscal year 23.
Wow.
They were 10-year bonds, and so this year, in fiscal 22, the budget we're getting ready to start, there's $33 million in debt service. In fiscal 23, there's a little over 17.3, and in fiscal 24, 0.
John, we need to have a celebration.
Yeah. Thank you.
Representative Petrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I may have a handful of questions. I think that
you please proceed.
On fiscal year 2023, the request is $629 million.
Yes, sir.
That's not the full request? That's the over and above request, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So we have statutory obligation plus a voluntary over appropriation to get us to the actuarial number?
It's the additional amount needed to implement the funding plan to pay off the legacy and liability. Yes, sir.
So 629, and if I understood you correctly, you don't have enough information to tell us what the 2024 request will be.
No, after the close of this fiscal year, and we have employer reports in, some more information coming in for this fiscal year, we will be able to provide an estimate, as we always do. And then the final number for the budget will be provided sometime later in the fall.
But it would be expected to be greater than the 2023 request.
It will not be less than the 2023 request. How much greater than the 2023 request is, I don't know. Again, that depends on some factors. For example, I think you will see an increase because of the valuation. Well, a lot of things are going to be going on with this 2021 valuation. You're going to see an increase in mortality. You're going to see...
It's going to be greater than 2023 request.
What we're going to see, the valuation's also going to include what could be a really exceptional year with investments, which will help offset that. The investment gains that we have this year, we saw that there were about $2.9 billion increase in liabilities with these assumption changes. So we had $4 billion in gains for the first 9 months alone. It is possible that the investment gains from this year alone are going to, more than address these assumption changes. And the question I have is, how will the board, with assistance from the actuary, decide to phase in those gains? So that's a question mark. So it could go up, but it may not go up as significantly as might be anticipated.
Correct. I'm just trying to narrow down whether we
Yes,
expect
sir.
an increase, a decrease, or exact same request. And it sounds like we expect an increase. We're not sure how much.
I think it is likely that if the board does do a phase in, there will be an increase. I just don't know the size. It will not decrease, I can tell you that.
On the payroll growth assumption, I think we had 2.75, and I think you gave an explanation of broad-based inflation and comparisons across what's happened and staying track with what's happening across the country. I'm wondering why specific information to Kentucky teacher payroll growth wasn't used similarly like was taken into account when you dealt with the mortality tables. Rather than taking broad-based information, you made it teacher-specific. I wondered why it went broad-based, the exact opposite method when looking at payroll growth.
Okay, so that's a good question. So the inflation component is broad-based. The inflation component is not Kentucky-based. That is what we see nationally, with inflation. And that inflation, like growing economy, kind of lifts all boats or sinks all boats. But that's what we're seeing nationally, okay? There is a teacher-specific component to that, because the 2.5% of that's inflation and 0.25% of that is real wage growth. Before this experience study, real wage growth, aside from inflation, but actual increase in salaries had been anticipated to be 0.5%. So they lowered that by 0.25% to 2.25%. Good question.
So is there a reason we went with the broad-based rather than the specific? It sounded like it was heavily loaded toward broad-based.
Well, just on inflation, it's we experience inflation just like we do with the rest of the country. Gasoline prices, fuel prices, those sort of things. When it goes up nationally, we see it go up in Kentucky as well. But there's not a inflation specific portion for just Kentucky. No,
Understood. Projections, do we have 30-year projections available through this study?
We have, those projections, it's kind of a hard, I'm trying to think of how to answer that question, but these are basically long-term assumptions over 30-year periods.
What I'm looking at is KRS 161-400-1B for 30-year projections on the experience study. And this is the study, but I don't see 30-year projections. Let's see. Actuarially recommended contribution rates for employees over a 30-year period. That's what I'm looking for, and I can't find it.
Yeah, so these assumptions are driven over what they expect to happen over the 30-year period. They're not just for the 5 years of the experience study, but they're long-term assumptions.
but I'm looking at recommended contribution rates over that 30-year period. So I'm looking at projections. Do we have any kind of projections like that?
I don't think we have 30-year projections.
Okay. Is there a reason that it's not there?
These, we do 30-year projections, I need to look into this a
Okay,
little
and I
bit
will
more,
say,
I
I
will.
appreciate it because last interim, TRS, and I think you were instrumental in this, provided me with 30-year projections, and I appreciate that. And what I'm after is this experience study by statute requires those projections to come out, and I don't find them. I was hoping to find them because I wanted to compare those to what I got last year so that I could see the increased rate of requirements on the general fund. And going from this, I had hoped it would remain steady, but at least I can see how much further that trajectory is taking an exponential climb. To figure out what not we're doing in just 23 and 24, but looking in 30, 35, and 40 so that we can plan for those long-term, what I see are largely increasing requirements on the general fund for those overpayments to reach an actuarial number. And so without that comparison, it's hard to figure out where we're going in the long term. 23 and 24 will be relatively easy compared to what's coming in the next 5 to 15 years based on last year's projections. So I'm wondering if that 15-year increase is going to hit sooner. And that's what I need. How soon could you provide those?
We'll get you an answer of this, we can do to staff this afternoon.
That would be great. And then I'll follow back up with you after I get that response back. And then if I'm looking at this right, if in light of the increases from the experience study up to the 629, has the board entertained or considered any modifications to benefit structures which aren't a part of the inviolable contract? So for instance, the third most impactful item you had in one of your slides, which would have been the sick pay?
So benefits like that, we consider that to be a policy decision of the Commonwealth. There have certainly been bills introduced in the General Assembly to, for example, cap sick leave pay. Our board does not take a position on that because we feel that's a policy decision of the Commonwealth. We provide data like cost savings if you were to cap sick leave, for example, and then that's what we do. And we're ready to do that for any future legislation as well. Yes, sir.
So it hasn't been considered, just studied, and the numbers are the numbers.
We provide the data and we assist the General Assembly in providing them information so they can assess if they want to make a policy decision to cap sick leave. We let them know the impact of that, whatever they need from us to understand, what that does for the liabilities. We're glad to do that. But as far as changing those benefits, we consider it a policy decision of the Commonwealth.
Understood. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
One thing I may also point, it's on these, I want to point out the payroll growth. We are lowering that, okay? So you will see more dollars requested in the budget because of lowering that payroll growth, because we're not getting those dollars from the contributions out of teacher salaries or from the employer. So on that side, so we get it, that has to be made up on the general fund side instead, so we'll be getting it there, but that will be increased dollars there. And so we'll be getting more dollars in early, and that will reduce the dollars in later years. So you'll see sort of more of a, not a flattening of that trajectory that, we've seen in the past.
Mr. Chairman, and if I may follow up just real quickly on this.
Yes, please proceed.
And that gets to why I'm wanting to make sure I'm looking at these assumptions correct and understanding why they're being changed and whether they're being changed enough based on the right data sets, because we come back in another 5 years with another experience study and we see assumptions that some of us think should have been changed already, and then they get changed 5 years from now, and then 5 years from now they get changed, and finally 15 years from now they're down to the rate where we think right now they ought to be. It keeps just stringing the General Assembly along of, well, the carrot's right there. Nope, it's a little further. Nope, it's a little further. It's a little more money. I'd rather get a fair assessment right now of what our situation is. Now, I also understand that when those assumptions move, it also puts a great burden on the general fund. So if you were to take payroll growth down even further, it's going to be a heavier hit on the general fund request for that over appropriation. Likewise, if you were to take your investment return down and discount that further, it's going to be a heavier request of that over appropriation by the general fund, by the General Assembly of the general fund. So I don't want that to happen, but I'd rather get an honest assessment of where we are as best we can get with honest assessments rather than expecting another change that's going to get us closer in 5 more years. That's not your fault, not necessarily the board's fault. I'm just making the comment, I'd appreciate the information now rather than being strung along with it.
Representative Petrie, I appreciate that completely. I want to assure you that the board and staff have that same goal. We want the best assumptions that are possible. They're not going to be perfect because we're trying to predict the future. Nobody can do that. But we want the best assumptions that are possible. And that's why we continually review these things. Annually we do. And that's why we make adjustments to budget requests annually. And that's why we do these experience studies every 5 years. And we don't want inflated assumptions. We want accurate assumptions. But we want assumptions that, we're not putting too much burden on, it's a trade-off. You want to put too much burden on taxpayers now and too little later. You're trying to get where you need to be, that in that 24-year period, you're 100% funded. So sometimes we get gains, sometimes we get losses. And so there's that 24-year trajectory from now to fully funded in 24 years. And it's not a fixed trajectory. It's something we make modifications to the left, to the right, all along the way. So we want the General Assembly to give them information that long-term we'll have these liabilities addressed and that we will be able to step in to additional funding. But yes, absolutely, we share the same goal that you do, sir.
Thank you. Bo, Representative Petrie kind of, touched on something I was curious about. The 3 things or three items outside the viable contract: sick pay, high 3, and the factor of 3. Can you tell us off the top of your head what each one of those cost as a percentage of payroll?
Okay, all 3 of those, and it's been a few years, the actuary looked at that. It was a little under 2%. I'm thinking like 1.8% maybe for all 3 of those. Like to look into that and follow up, but that's my recollection. And that was maximum savings. And the reason I say maximum savings is one of those 3 items you mentioned is the high 3. And what that means is for our members who retire with 27 years of service, but more importantly, at age 55, their retirement allowances are calculated on their 3 highest salaries instead of their 5 highest salaries. So yes, that does have the effect of increasing their retirement allowance that they're going to draw one day. But there's an offsetting gain from that, in that teachers, once 27 years and out came in to play, they can retire theoretically as early as 49. We have some, not many, but we have some that do that. So that means we're paying out benefits, early, really early. So that high 3 was put in at age 55 as a way to motivate our members to defer retirement. That's good for the retirement system because we are, deferring paying out benefits for many years. And in fact, when our members come in to TRS and they talk to one of our retirement counselors and they're 52, our retirement counselor says, why don't you wait till 55, look what happens, And we have a chart, and we've shared that with this board, that shows the age at which people are retiring. And it's a bar chart, orange bars, and the tallest bar by far, nothing else is close to, is age 55. So it shows that peg, you can motivate people to stay in longer and change retirement patterns with what we call carrots, incentivize them. So if that were to go away, yes, that means no more high 3s. That means some lower retirement allowances, but it also means that bar is going to evaporate, age 55, and it's not going to shift to the right, it will shift to the left. So that's what's kind of hard, to determine. So there's, the cost of that. And so that's when I say that 1.86 is just my memory, and that could be wrong, percentage of payroll savings. The actuary said that's a maximum savings.
Okay. Representative Miller.
Thank you. And following up on Chairman Petrie's comments and Chairman Higdon's comments, I've often thought that the KRS, who has changed to they don't wait 5 years for every one of their experience studies, for all their assumption experience studies. They're on some kind of rolling cycle. I think that's an excellent idea. 5 years doesn't really meet up with this year, I guess it will, because next year we have a budget, but in 5 years, that won't. I'd like to see you all split it up into two groups, and maybe you do the economic assumptions in 2 years and then the demographic in 4 years, and then you just keep that rolling. So the impact on the budget is a little more modified, so we don't have this horrible thing facing us every 5 years. I would very much appreciate your TRS's input on what's reasonable, what should be done, because I'd like to standardize it across all the retirement systems, personally. You can comment, or you can just get back with me next meeting.
I will need to get back with you on that question.
Thank you.
Representative Wheatley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Bo, for your presentation today. Lots of questions are coming, and my questions that I had when I first asked to present a question has been touched on a few times. So let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned a trend that other states are doing, like Georgia, North Carolina, maybe South Carolina, Mississippi, where there are adjustments made within the 5-year period. It sounds like that may not be a policy yet, but a policy that the board is considering. So you can comment on that. And is that for all the assumption possibilities? And further along with that, has that been done in practice already in past years? Assumption changes were made by the board within the 5-year period.
Yeah. So, good question. So those states that are taking assumption changes and phasing them some way, they do that in different ways. So it's not one standard way of doing it, but they are addressing assumption changes in a more measured way as opposed to all at once, because they know there's a lot of moving parts always, continually. So they are finding a way to bring those changes in over a period of time in various different ways, as opposed to all at once. And that is not something that TRS has done in the past, okay? And again, this is sort of a newer thing that we're seeing. Our actuary discussed that with us, because you have several states now that are starting to do that. It's a very measured way of stepping into new return assumptions, because they can change. The next 5 years they can change again, and that allows you the opportunity to evaluate what changes may be in the next one and respond. So that is something that would take board action. We have a funding policy in place, and the board would need to consider that. I don't know what they will do, but they would need to consider that, and then the funding policy would be amended to reflect a change like that and how it would occur, what it would look like.
Thank you, sir. You have another question? Okay. All right. Senator Mills.
Back to the items we referred to as outside the inviolable contract.
Yes, sir.
So you referred to those decisions as policy decisions that you and the TRS board would rather the legislature make. When they were added as benefits, like when the COLA was added, when the high 3 was added, were those policy decisions that were made by the legislature, or were they suggested by the TRS board at that time? Do you remember?
Those things existed before, and I've been there 22 years. They existed before me, so I'm not sure how those happened. I'm afraid I don't. And the sick leave is actually even in a statute that's not a TRS statute. It's in a Department of Education statute, KRS 161-155. So I don't know how that came about. That could have been by education groups or department or school districts. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Okay. And then you referred to the total cost when Senator Higdon asked about the total cost of those items outside the inviolable contract as being around 2%. Now, can you put that in terms of our annual contribution from our budget? How much would that save us, our budget annually, if those items were not there
Okay.
in round numbers.
Okay, sure. And again, with the caveat that those are maximum savings. So a percentage point is it's roughly $35 million. So high 60s million dollars, again, maximum savings. So I think if the high three were really considered, fully, and the effect that it has in keeping our members longer, and you're looking more at sick leave, you're looking probably more at $45 million, $50 million. That's the big one. The 3 points factor for years, just for those years work beyond 30, which is another carrot offered to keep teachers working, that's not much of a factor. The big one there really is sick leave. So the sick leave is, and I can get you more recent numbers, the cost of sick leave, but we're talking probably in the $50 million range for sick leave a year.
And then finally, so in your opinion, or is it your opinion that the $69 million cost or whatever are money well spent for carrots moving forward? Or as far as, we always hear when we talk about making changes to teacher pension, we always talk about we're going to lose teachers. We're going to have to hire. We're going to have a big a void of new teachers coming in, losing experience. So, is that a carrot that you think keeps people working longer?
The sick leave, or
I was kind of referring to all three of them.
Okay.
All three of them.
The high three definitely is a carrot, without a doubt, that keeps them working longer. And that chart, I can bring that again to the next meeting of the board. And it really just visually, graphically shows how successful that high three works in keeping them teaching longer. The 3% factor for years worked, just for those years worked past 30 to try to keep them working, that probably has some effect, and not nearly as much as the high three in keeping them in longer. Sick leave, I don't know that necessarily keeps them in working longer, and that's not really, something we see necessarily as, maybe it does. They want to keep on accumulating sick leave, but I think the bigger issue there is really a non-retirement issue, and that is what we hear again from superintendents, administrators, that they value sick leave used for retirement calculation purpose as a way to decrease absenteeism in the school districts, decrease turnover where teachers are taking their sick leave instead of saving it for retirement. And then they're seeing, disruption in the classroom environment, and they're paying for the cost of the sub to come in and replace them. And then that's what I'm just repeating what I hear from them about how they value it.
Any further questions? I do want to bring up one point that in 2018, when we did Senate Bill 151, the General Assembly took a bold move and agreed to statutorily require ourselves to make that ARC payment every year. And also, we went to a level dollar, which pretty much at the time committed us to about $400 million additional at the time on top of the $500 million. So that was a pretty bold move at the time, and I think it just shows that we want to get this thing, the underfunding and these escalating every year more money, because we'd like to, every year we'll have a little more money in our budget, but it seems like every time we have a little more money in our budget that our retirement costs increase and puts a strain on Representative Petrie and Chairman McDaniel when they're puts them in a bad mood. Trying to make ends meet, not that they're putting it in pensions. It's just trying to make ends meet. And all the requests that we get, I've been in some of those meetings, and the request for funding through the budget is tremendous. So, seeing no further questions, motion to adjourn.